Okay, I'm gonna make a video on my research about urine diverting dry toilets and vermicomposting or worm composting. So for the past 5 years or so, I've been investigating what I need to do to legally compost the um, what they call biological nutrients recovery now. And it's fascinating because it turns out there's official academic research corroborating my claims. So it started out with calling the state pollution control agency that enforces the permits, and I asked if I need a permit for a composting toilet. This was 5 years ago, and the person said, there's no discharge, is there? And I said no, and he said then no permit is needed. So obviously that was very exciting news for me, and it was this fellow here. I called the Duluth office, and so I figured out it had to have been this guy, and he has an environmental science degree, so he knows ecology, he knows sustainable management, he also knows traditional culture because he has a degree in First Nations. So this was obviously very exciting for me, but at the same time I was still skeptical because I know you got to be super careful with the government. So then I called up the county planner for septics and told him what I wanted to do with the composting toilet, and he's like, I asked him if it had ever been approved for a year-round dwelling, a primitive dwelling. He said not for a year-round, and I said because the county to the north does approve year-round composting toilets. And so he said, well, we would have to check it out. And then he's like, but maybe you should get an incinerating toilet. And so I realized after talking to him that he did not understand composting at all. So this got me even more curious. And so then I realized that I ended up ordering. I already had one urine diverting dry toilet, but it was a Nature's Head, and he said, we've approved composting toilets for seasonal use, and sure enough, Nature's Head has been approved by various counties. I've seen the permits for Nature's Head. But one of the complaints for the urine diverting dry toilet is the Nature's Head doesn't really dry. It doesn't achieve a drying process. So then I discovered this toilet that this environmental engineer designed for mainly in developing countries, and it's a self-contained urine diverting dry toilet. So you have what he did is he took the rotating drum design that is used in a National Sanitation Foundation certified toilet by Sunmar, the Centrex model. So when you have that rotating drum, then you get aerobic digestion, and then that takes like maybe, depending on how much you use it, but then you end up, what I would do is I'd have mycelium in the rotating drum. So already experimented with what they call a micro toilet, which is being studied in at University of British Columbia in their botanical gardens. They set up a research project this past summer. So I tried that out also using oyster mycelium, and it worked amazingly well. There was no smell because the mycelium just eats up the feces. And there's going to be a little bit of moisture, so that's what the mycelium needs to do that, because the feces is like 85% moisture. So I would immediately have the mycelium in this rotating drum, and then there'd be no smell. That this also has a vent. And then after rotating that to make sure it has enough air and it gets aerobic digestion is what the EPA calls it for biosolids. And then it goes into this composting drawer. So then what I did is I contacted the Pollution Control Agency for biosolids. And I asked, well, do I need a permit for this? Because if you're doing domestic biosolids as land application, you do not need a permit if you're creating biosolids on your own land. But the biosolids person did not respond to me at all, and they just sent me back over to the septic person, and this septic person was down in the southern part of the state, and they just basically said, well, if it's any kind of septage for a composting toilet, then you have to get a permit. So he sent me these same regulations that I'm going to go over right now. Okay, so that sort of sent me back to square one. Now, what's interesting about this design versus the Nature's Head is the Nature's Head has a vault, whereas this is called an open vault design, which means that there's really no water. There's no waterproof vault in this, because you have this rotating drum that's got an opening to it, and you're rotating it. I mean, it has a mechanism that self-closes based on the direction that you rotate it. It's just a little hinge. There's a couple hinges, so it hangs down, so if you rotate it in the direction of the hanging, then it's going to close on you, and then if you rotate it the opposite way, it'll flip back against the wall. So you can only have it like 80% full for that to work. Okay, so then I kept taking a deep dive into the statutes based on what the original septic guy told me from the MPCA, that if there's no discharge, then you do not need a permit. So what does that mean as far as discharge? Well, it means you don't have any plumbing. So this does not have any plumbing. Also, there's no tank. So again, there's nothing to dispose from a tank, because the septage is based on having sewage. So the sewage means you're using liquid waste with plumbing. And then when you remove it from a tank, then it's septage. That's what the definition of septage is. But with this design, you're separating it before, so you're having source separated compost. And then you get aerobic digestion immediately. So then, and with the mycelium composting, so you're turning it into what the EPA calls Class B biosolids. And if you don't, and then they say that takes 3 months of aerobic digestion to achieve. So then if there's no contact with any new sewage, you could say sewage is also just any kind of toilet material, because you're going to have water from, in the feces, so that would be, we'll also call that sewage, even though it's waterless and it's separated from the urine. But if it hasn't dried out yet, then it would still be sewage. So in this bottom compost tray, after 3 months, based on the EPA, that would be Class B biosolids. So what the last guy said, that the county, the state statute just assumes that anything coming out of a composting toilet would be septage and not biosolids, based on the agricultural definition. And so basically, this is also the problem that happened in Vermont, was they were not separating the waste, and so they were using the Jenkins method with a bucket on a farm without any kind of separation, and then so the county shut it down, and so now they're trying to get a state law in Vermont that would allow composting on their farm. So you can see that there's a conflict, there's a paradox going on here. And so I just kept digging deeper into the research of these statutes, and I finally found this comment last night in the middle of the night. So in 2006, the State Pollution Control Agency convened a discussion on their septic permitting process, and the statute is referring to toilet waste treatment device, and they have this commentary: amounts generated are small, fairly well decomposed, and contain no free liquid. Therefore, allowing the disposal of such material by the system owner is appropriate. It is anticipated that the material will be bagged and disposed of in a sanitary landfill. So this obviously is referring to the same kind of composting toilet that's a self-contained, similar to the Nature's Head that I already had before I bought this second one. So it says the amount generated is small, fairly well decomposed, and contains no free liquid. Therefore, disposal of such material by the system owner is appropriate. Okay, so the question is, well, what is disposal? Basically, the issue is there's removal and then there's disposal. So you're, according to the statute, you're not allowed to remove. If it's removed, then it's septage. Anything removed is considered to be septage. And so, okay, so again, you have this conflict between what's defined as septage and what's defined as biosolids, because for the state, you can compost biosolids, but that's done at a treatment facility that gets a permit, and then the land application does not get a permit. But if you do it domestically, based on the EPA, a domestic septage for a farm would not require a permit as long as it's first being processed by the farmer. So the state then says they do not advocate mixing the domestic septage with animal manure on farms, but they say that the way they address this is through the residential dwelling permit for a septic subsurface tank or treatment device. Okay, so when we look at this is the privy permit, that if you get a composting toilet, it's considered a privy permit. It used to be separated from privy permit, but then they contained it for primitive dwellings. They said that since those often use privies, that they would just combine the two. And so if you have a privy that has a tank, a watertight holding tank. So that's what I was trying to remember for the Nature's Head, that has that watertight holding tank. But that is not the case for this open vault design. There's no watertight holding tank because you have this open flap rotating drum, and then you just have this open bin. It's contained in this device, but I don't know if I'd call that watertight. It's not a tank. It's a drum and a tray in a box. Okay. So, again, the first person I talked to at the pollution control agency said if there's no discharge, then no permit is needed. So that's at the state level. At the county level, they're saying yes, you do need a permit. So the privy statute says you have to employ a watertight tank or a toilet treatment device. So the question is, well, what is a toilet treatment device? So if we study the statute, we realize that they're actually relying on this marine definition of a holding tank, but also a composting, incinerating, or recirculating device. So again, this is how Nature's Head was designed, as a watertight tank for Nature's Head. And so when you look at this Minnesota statute, they have the same phrasing of incinerating, recirculating, and composting, or a holding tank for the toilet treatment device. And so then the privy permit refers to applicable requirement of the state statute can be used instead of a pit for a permit. So self-contained water. So if you go to that you get a sewage tank. So again, they're assuming that a toilet waste treatment device is a sewage tank with liquid capacity. So again, that would be a discharge based on using liquid waste, which is not necessarily flushing with water. It can be a waterless tank for a pit, but it's combining the urine and the feces, and that's why it has a liquid capacity, because when you combine it. And then they used to have this experimental and alternative system, but then they repealed this particular part. So that was part of the 2004 or 2006 revamp of the statutes. And so when we look at the county, here's another county statute. It says that it's referring to the same marine Or any clause about holding tanks, composting. So again, these are assuming a waterless, watertight tank, and that these devices will be allowed. And then, so what's interesting is that when you look at the rewording of the state statute that I refer to up here, let's see right here, they said that the Pollution Control Agency has expressed valid reasons for not mentioning water softener waste. This company, Alaskan, and it always comes back to private corporations that basically control the regulatory agencies. So they said they're concerned that gray water waste stream used as feed for livestock would be classified as sewage. Now, I had no idea that was even allowed. I'm going to look into that because I'm really fascinated that you would use gray water as a feed for livestock. Anyway, the control agency says, well, okay, we're going to change the definition of sewage to make sure that so they crossed out the liquid waste produced by toilets and just changed it to waste produced by toilets. And then they say the waste streams constitute sewage. So again, you have toilet waste is not the same as liquid waste. In other words, you don't have to have a discharge with a plumbing for it to be toilet waste. But they are assuming that the sewage, it's not separated for composting. And so, again, this is fascinating because when you look at the discussion for this definition for toilet waste, the reason they have this definition is because they want to exclude like feminine products or other things that could get into the device. But then they say that some of these toilet waste treatment devices can handle those other products. So that's why they have this definition here. Kind of interesting. Okay, so when we get to the concept of a urine diverting dry toilet is a zero waste toilet. In other words, that what you're putting into the toilet is not waste because you're directly composting it. So that's the difference between having this definition of waste, because you're immediately source separating it as compost, and hence it is zero waste. So these are being set up across the world. They're also called ecological sanitation. They're being promoted by the United Nations. They're being tested, and so again, if you do not mix the liquid and urine, then you don't get sewage smell. It's not sewage yet. It's so when you look up the definition of sewage for the state control agency, they're saying that it's water carried domestic waste. So again, that's why the state scientists told me that if there's no discharge, then I don't need a permit. And they're assuming that toilet has liquid waste as waste. So the idea here is that if you do not mix the liquid yellow water or urine with the feces, then it's no longer liquid waste. And as I pointed out, there's even that commentary in the to that toilet waste treatment device where they're saying that it is going to be mainly decomposed. It's small, fairly well decomposed, and contains no free liquid. So they've done studies on this proving that the dry, urine diverting dry toilet, after 12 months, it is pretty much all decomposed, or it's all dehydrated, so there's no liquid. So that would mean that this whole toilet waste treatment device does not apply, because there's no waterless tank. There's no liquid capacity for the tank. There's no discharge to a treatment device, and so this brings us back to the that definition got changed of the toilet waste, where they took the liquid part out because they didn't want the manufacturer of advanced treatment devices prohibits water softener backwash as gray water. So that's why they took that liquid part out of the definition of toilet waste, because the water softener companies didn't want it to be considered to be sewage. So that's, again, a fascinating little side conversation of what is the definition of sewage. So when I talked to the county planner, he's basically, as I said, he didn't seem to understand composting at all, and he recommended, a incinerating toilet. So that is an option I could do. I could just burn the as disposal. I could just burn the remaining dry. What do they say again? It is anticipated the material will be disposed of in the same. So I could just burn it because it contains no free liquid and fairly well decomposed, and the amounts generated are small. Okay, so according to the county, if you have any kind of structure with a toilet waste treatment device, then you need a permit. Now the question is, again, if there's no waterless tank, then is it a toilet waste treatment device? And sure enough, when you go into this discussion back in 2006, they used the same phrase in the state statute in 1994 for a toilet waste treatment device, but back then they don't use composting toilet at all. It's not included as an option. Now that's very fascinating that it's not included, and they're just assuming that a toilet waste treatment device is a holding tank based on the marine definition. So that just proves that the whole concept of composting is not, it's just completely off the radar for the regulatory agencies. And so then there is another county in the state that actually acknowledges composting toilets separate than a holding tank. So let me see if I can find that. Okay, so right here, there's a county that says the toilet waste treatment device is an incinerating and composting toilet, and it's not a holding tank or chemical tank or biological tank. But by biological, they mean this marine definition, where you're treating it's called dosing dosing a holding tank with a biological, and so you buy aerobic bacteria that you dose into the tank. So basically, you're trying to mimic a aerobic composting in a tank. Okay, so this county is saying, look, if you're in a primitive dwelling, you can have a composting tank as long as you do not have running water. But then they say, as the only method of sewage treatment. So again, by sewage, they're assuming that you're creating sewage in the first place, but if you have no liquid waste, then it's not sewage. And so the so then I found another county in this is actually in California, where they have the same exact ordinance where they're acknowledging this incinerating and composting toilet. But they say it has to be a National Sanitation Foundation certified device only as a composting toilet. So what's fascinating about that is that they're saying that, these composting toilets, they have a vault and that sits beneath the unit, and therefore you need a building permit. If you're doing any kind of retrofit for the vault, you would need a building permit, and of course then you'd need a septic permit for that originally. And then they say, well, can you compost it on your land? And say no, because it's incomplete composting and it can't be verified by the county. So that's in California. Now, when we look at the National Sanitation Foundation approved composting toilets, we find something very, very fascinating, is that the composting toilets are defined as a saturated treatment system. Non-liquid, so it's a waterless toilet, but it's saturated. Why is it saturated? Because you're combining the yellow water with the black water, and that's what makes it saturated. So then we get to the research of this fellow Hill, Jeff Hill, in British Columbia, and he did his PhD on composting toilets. And so he points out that when you combine the yellow water with the black water, then you have soaked feces, because there's not urine diversion. And so when you have the fecal waste saturated with urine, the urea changes to ammonia, and that prevents the composting of prevents the aerobic bacteria and worms and slugs and whatever from composting the feces. And so you get this soggy and smelly waste. And instead, when you use a urine diverting dry toilet, then the solid waste is low density toilet paper and some feces, because the feces is 85% water, so that you get aerobic digestion, which is the definition of Class B biosolids by the EPA. And then this feedstock can be vermicomposted by worms, and that destroys the pathogens. So he did a research study on this, that the vermicomposting toilets are far superior than normal composting toilets, because of this source separated composting. And so they studied the waste for this, and this brings us back to the urine diverting dry toilets that are considered to be ecological sanitation. And again, there's no discharge, so no permit needed. So are you removing septage? Well, again, if we look at the definition of septage, as in terms of a toilet waste treatment device, the domestic waste includes liquid waste produced by toilets. So you're not having sewage because there's no water there's no discharge from water that's carrying the domestic waste. There's no liquid waste because it's non-liquid when it's removed. So this difference between composting toilets with and without urine diversion is actually now officially recognized in the 2015 Green Supplement to the Uniform Plumbing Code. But again, that's assuming you're having some kind of plumbing with a discharge. But if there's no pipe with no discharge, then you're not even having any plumbing. So this is the study where they found after 6 months of drying, the water content is less than 25%. And so this is what they call a zero waste toilet, since you're not producing waste because you're just going to compost it directly. So what they're saying is that that the composting is not allowed, but that's assuming you're using some kind of treatment device that requires a permit in the first place. Whereas if it's a farmer with domestic septage as biosolids, then they do allow composting with no permit necessary. And so if you're composting it and dehydrating it based on source separation with no treatment device, then you're creating biosolids. As long as you're in a non-public area for farming, then this is allowed with no permit needed. So this is how it would be done in the developing countries, where they let it sit. So technically by the state statute here, after a year it's no longer septage. But again, septage is assuming you're removing it from some kind of sewage tank. So when we look at I used the artificial intelligence answer, just because that's what everything's based on AI now. And so this is what AI said from collating all the online research. Yes, in theory, septage can be removed from a dry toilet, but septage is the liquid and solid material that's removed from septic tanks and other sewage treatment units, and it's resistant to dewatering. So that's why they use chemicals to treat it. And so then they say composting toilets are an alternative to septic tanks. So again, so the question is, as long as you're not removing it within a year, then it's no longer septage if it has no contact with sewage. And if it never had any liquid waste to begin with as discharge into a tank, then it's not a treatment device. And so again, no permit needed. Now, based on the county definition of a composting toilet, they're assuming it's like what the Forest Service used for composting toilets, and these are what are called centralized toilets, so they all have tanks. So in this case, they use a Clivus Multrum tank, or this waste recovery system tank, or an evaporation tank. And they're not doing source separation with these tanks. There's no source separation, so the problem is that you get terrible odors for the maintenance of the tanks. So again, that's how the National Sanitation Foundation defines a composting toilet, as they're assuming this watertight tank that combines the liquid yellow water with the feces that creates this odor. So it's a mixed solid waste. But if you're doing a source separation, then you don't have any mixed solid waste. So, for example, if you're camping, then you don't have to have any permit. But you also have to follow sewage treatment standards. But again, the definition of sewage is this liquid waste that's discharged through plumbing. And so if you're doing source separation, then you don't have sewage, as long as it's a container-based sanitation that is sealed and then wouldn't be removed for 12 months. So according to the state pollution control agency, if you have any structure that's built on a tank, then it needs a septic permit. So again, if you don't have a tank and there's no discharge into the tank, then you don't need a permit, according to the pollution control agency scientists that I talked to. So here we have, this is called a container-based sanitation instead of a tank. It's a container. And so it's not a composting toilet, it's a compost toilet that has a tank that you then use to compost. So the Jeff Hill, he calls this a source separating vermicomposting toilet. And you can get these in Europe. So it's not the same as a central composting toilet that the National Sanitation Foundation has approved as a composting toilet. And so when you look online, there's people are doing this source separation with urine diverting, what they call urine diverting dry toilet. It's basically it's gone viral. Like anybody doing composting, this is how they do it. But they say, well, because it's passive, it's going to take longer. But with the vermicomposting, then you get a complete sanitation process. So when they have in the statute a definition of a toilet waste treatment device, they say that the septage must not be discharged. Again, by discharge they mean a plumbing pipe. So if you're not using any kind of tank with that's pumped, then there's no discharge. There's no vault being pumped. So based on this county in California, they're saying, no, you cannot compost on your own land because the county can't verify that it's being composted. Okay, well, if you're, again, if you're camping or in a primitive environment, then if you're camping, you don't need a permit, but you still have to follow the sewage treatment ordinances. But if you're not producing sewage that's discharged, then you don't. Then there's no ordinance to follow because it's not sewage. So that leaves you on your own to complete the composting. And they basically say if you're doing it on your own, you just need to bury it. But that's after you are disposing of it. But if you're not disposing of it and it's zero waste, then you can compost it. So this is, like I said, this is getting official academic research. It's called biological nutrient removal. Now they're assuming, again, they're still assuming a liquid waste system. And so they call that the source separation of toilet waste. And so they're having conferences on this with the Water Environment Foundation is holding conferences on this. So that's again assuming you're using a water-based system, but the dry toilet is not a water-based system. There's no liquid waste. No discharge, and so no liquid capacity. So it's just not covered as any kind of treatment device tank. There's no sewage because it's not a liquid system. When you do the source separation, you're getting dehydration. So no free liquid is what they're saying here. With you have a treatment device, it's going to be decomposed with no free liquid. Well, if you're separating it, doing source separation, then it's going to achieve aerobic digestion and be dehydrated. So it'll be a class B biosolid with no tank, no watertight tank. So it's not a device that receives sewage, because this, by definition, the sewage is this liquid waste in a discharge system. water carried domestic waste. So when you look at the definition of the toilet waste treatment device, they're saying that it is discharge. Any pollution is sewage that's discharged into a disposal system. So again, there's no discharge of sewage. Now they're saying that domestic septic is a treatment works that receives sewage. Again, so they're assuming a water liquid discharge system. So they call it a treatment works for the wastewater permit. And then when they say a treatment device, they're saying septic is a device that receives sewage. So they're calling this the same treatment device as the same kind of holding tank. And then later on they added this composting option as a treatment device. So again, they're assuming a tank that receives black water as sewage, as a watertight tank based on a sewage tank as by the definition. So they're calling it either a treatment works or a treatment device that receives domestic sewage through a liquid waste system with a discharge. So that means that a urine diverting dry container does not qualify as a toilet waste treatment device that needs a permit. So that's exactly what the MPCA told me. The scientists, environmental scientists, said if there's no discharge, then you do not need a permit. So so they're assuming that it's going to be disposed of or bagged. Now, what they also say, if you look at this definition, it says that anything that's had any kind of contact with any kind of sewage is still septic for 1 year. Let me see if I can find that one. Should have it in here. Let's see. Okay, I can find this eventually. No, maybe it's not in here. I can search it. This is 12. So here they did a study on the urine diverting dry toilets and found that 9 to 12 months, because you get a 99% reduction of any kind of Okay, months. Okay, so I don't have that. I already did that. 12. Whoops. Okay, so basically, so when you have a container-based sanitation, then you're not having a tank, watertight tank. You're doing a source-separated composting process. And so you're not removing septage because it was never part of a liquid discharge sewage system. So it's not waste, it's zero waste. And so then you can do vermicomposting with worms. After it's dehydrated. And so that's pretty much the research that I've done, is that they're assuming if you have any premises, so that would be your land that you're occupying. So you'd have to do this as a camping site, because they're assuming that any kind of use of a composting toilet would still be sewage, even though it's waterless, and even though it's source separated. And and that's just because they can't verify that it's actually getting composted. So you have to do that on your own. And you're not discharging any septage at that point.